And looks like we are back. This is part 2 of the lecture 5 for Econ 182. Why would the governments want to change the exchange rate? There are two main reasons. One is to affect the economic growth or the economy through current account. When the government changes the exchange rate, it changes the relative prices of exports and imports. And that way, it's going to affect the current account. And current account is a component of GNP, so it's going to affect output. As an example, let's think of what happens when the government decides to make a currency cheaper. When it makes a domestic currency cheaper, foreign consumers find exports from our country cheaper because our firms have their expenses in our local currency, so they're able to sell the goods overseas at more competitive prices when expressed in a foreign currency. And so the foreigners are going to find our exports more competitive, and our exporters would be able to increase their market share, which stimulates output and production in our economy, creates jobs, etc., etc. The other effect of a cheaper currency is that now imports are more expensive for our consumers. Now, that's not great for consumers if they want to buy imported goods, but it's actually good for import competing industries because some consumers are going to now switch from buying imported goods that are now too expensive to buying domestic goods, therefore also increasing the production domestically. So both export effect and the import effect of cheaper currency are going to stimulate output. So in this particular case, weaker currency, in fact, could be good for economic development. And the government can choose to depreciate the currency for that reason. Another reason to control the currency is to control inflation. If inflationary expectations in the country are high, one way to control them is to fix the prices. Now, all the prices are kind of hard to fix, although that has been done historically. But there's one price that's relatively easy to fix, is the exchange rate. That's the price of foreign currency. And it affects expectations in two ways. First, through the commitment mechanism, or what's called nominal anchor. So you have a commitment by the government to not allow currency to depreciate, and therefore it's a signal that the government is not going to allow much inflation, and that's the one way to control inflationary expectations. Another way, if the exchange rate is fixed, it controls the prices of imported goods, because if the currency stops depreciating, then the foreign goods stop becoming more expensive. And that's another way in which inflationary expectations could be revised. So obviously, those going in the opposite direction. If you want to stimulate growth, you might want to have a cheaper currency, a weaker currency. But if you want to control inflation, you need to have a stronger currency and not allow the currency to depreciate. Why would exchange rate be ever out of control? There are a number of reasons for that. One and very common reason is the lack of central bank independence. If the government runs a large budget deficit, it has a huge incentive to create inflation. First of all, because printing money creates revenues, which allows to finance the budget deficit directly. Another way to think about that is if there is inflation in the country and the debt is nominal, then the government can borrow 1,000 pesos, say today, but when it repays 1,000 pesos a year from now, this 1,000 pesos are not going to be worth as much because of inflation. It's not going to be, the debt is going to be depreciating or deflating in its real value. If the government prints money to finance budget deficit, that creates inflation and creates currency depreciation. And if the central bank is not independent, it cannot do anything about that. It just has to keep printing money to finance budget deficits. And that's a story of hyperinflation in many Latin American countries in the 80s following 1982 debt crisis that we'll discuss later in this semester. Another reason why exchange rates could be out of control is due to inflationary expectations. If people expect high inflation, they're trying to get rid of their currency because it's not going to be worth as much pretty soon. So they're trying to buy foreign currency whenever they can. And that way, they're going to put deflationary pressure, they're going to put downward pressure on their currency because they're trying to sell it. So they're going to be pushing the price of their home currency down. Here's an example of exchange rate history for Argentina, going back about over 100 years. And you can see that those lines are interrupted, and that's because Argentina has been rebasing the exchange rate. So basically, there was a price of peso per dollar. You grab the so there's a price of peso per dollar, and notice that this is a logarithmic scale. So from 1914 to 1950, there were a few episodes of pretty sharp peso depreciation, if you realize that this is a logarithmic scale. But then it just went completely out of control from 1950 to 1960. And eventually, in early 1970s, the government in Argentina decided that it needs to be rebased. So basically, they scratch off a few zeros, and the exchange rate went from 500 down to 5. So the new peso was introduced, and that did not do much good because, in fact, that did not help at all. And the inflation and the depreciation went through the roof again. And just within just a few years, the exchange rate went through the roof very quickly in Argentina. And Argentina is the case of lack of central bank independence and printing money in order to finance the budget deficit. So the currency was rebased again. So if you want to have continuous series, you just need to glue those lines back together. But then, of course, it's going to be just turned into a vertical line pretty quickly. And that didn't even last long. Remember 1980s, we have a Latin American debt crisis. And so there were a few rebasings of Argentine currency. And then finally, in 1991, after another bout of depreciation, they introduced currency board, which lived for 10 years. So you can see here the currency board and the threefold depreciation that followed the crisis in 2001. And since then, the exchange rate has depreciated, but not as dramatic as we observed in the past. So they're hopefully putting their act together. They're floating, they have inflation targeting, and not trying to fix the exchange rate at the level that is not going to hold. Pardon me. This is another example of an insane exchange rate. That's one of my favorite banknotes. It's a $100 trillion. These are not US dollars. These are Zimbabwe dollars. And this has been a few years ago. I don't remember exactly the year. I think 3 or 4 years ago, they actually scratched 12 of those zeros. So it became a $100 bill rather than $100 trillion bill. At this time, when they got rid of the zeros, 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars were equal to about 157 of the US dollars. So that's another example that you can look up. Another issue that I wanted to discuss when the governments control their currencies is so-called beggar thy neighbor policies. It's a general term that defines policies that benefit one country at the cost of another. And an example of such a policy is what's called competitive devaluations. Competitive devaluations is when a country is devaluing its currency with a goal of increasing the market share of its exporters to take advantage of another currency, and then another country responds by devaluing its currency. So when countries are involved in this kind of back and forth or tit for tat or competitive devaluations, it could lead to currency wars. And those currency wars are costly and have absolutely no effect on trade. Uh, so if one country devalues, say, by 20%, and in response, another country also devalues by 20%, then all that has changed is whatever methods they use to devalue. So exchange rate is actually going to return to its initial level, and there is not going to be any effect on trade. But the cost of doing that potentially could be a domestic inflation. If, in order to devalue the domestic exchange rate, they print money or lower interest rates. And this is a difference between the currency wars and the trade wars. In the trade wars, countries put up trade barriers in response to another country's trade barriers. And as a result of trade wars, both sides keep increasing their trade barriers, which leads to the decline in trade. With currency wars, usually you're not going to have an effect, with the exception of the fact that if the currencies start fluctuating because it takes some time for one country to respond to another, unpredictable fluctuations in exchange rates create uncertainty in the market and can also harm trade, but not as much as the trade barriers. However, the currency wars are still costly because they are likely increase inflation in both countries and not have any effect on relative prices. So competitive devaluations don't really work. So for last few years, you can read in the news that emerging markets feel that the dollar should be stronger. The Fed should raise its interest rates. Why would they want to do that? Well, so first of all, we can see on this chart that if the Fed increases its interest rate, as it did once last December after the zero lower bound, but hasn't increased it since, the exchange rate is going to appreciate. Dollar is going to appreciate. Why would emerging markets want this to happen is because they don't want to depreciate their currencies unilaterally. It's much easier for them if dollar appreciates because of the Fed policies, and that automatically would improve their exchange rate, would depreciate their currency vis-a-vis dollar automatically and help their exports. And because a lot of countries are struggling with economic growth at the moment, they would all benefit if the Fed raises interest rates. But of course, the Fed has primary goal of US economic growth, full employment, and stable inflation. And so until the US economic growth is solid enough and inflation is stable enough and not close to zero, the Fed would not raise the rates simply because emerging markets would benefit from it. So in the summer of 2013, Ben Bernanke, then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, announced that the Fed is going to start tapering its asset purchases. So what that meant is that eventually, so it was the talk he gave in June, where he announced that by the end of the year 2013, the Fed is going to taper, so it's going to slow down a rate at which it's purchasing assets in the open market. So it's not the tightening of the monetary policy. In fact, the intention of the speech was that we're not going to stop buying assets. We're just going to slow down buying assets, and we're not going to do it until the very end of 2013. The markets, however, reacted to this very strongly. They interpreted it as the Fed sees that the economy is improving and it's going to stop the quantitative easing and is going to start raising rates. And the markets are trying to preempt that. And so instantly, US long-term rates increased at that time. As the interest rates, long-term interest rates in the US increased, investing in the long-term assets in the US became much more attractive than it was before. And so the money moved out of emerging markets into the US long-term securities and bonds. Um, and that created substantial problems in the emerging markets. And that's what was referred to as taper tantrum. So the tantrum was by the capital flows in response to the taper talk by Bernanke. So is the US waging currency war by keeping interest rates low? And the answer to that, no, even though there is some talk in the media about that, the reasons for low interest rates in the US are 100% domestic. The US is not looking at how other countries are doing and trying to make them do worse. The Fed's mandate is 100% domestic, and while we do take into account what happens in the foreign markets in response to our actions, we're not waging a currency war. In fact, there is a very nice economic letter by my colleague Fernanda Necchia, which shows that money did not leave all emerging markets. The capital flows left emerging markets that were already in some sense troubled. Either there was a lot of debt, or there was a lot of current account deficit, or budget deficit, or high inflation. So whatever was the riskiest investment, those capital flows turned around and went into the US. But if the countries were stable with low inflation and low debt and low deficit, then the money did not actually turn around. There was no tantrum for those economies. So central banks mostly can intervene directly in foreign exchange markets to affect the value of their currency, as we discussed. So in addition to moving interest rates, they can just go buy and sell foreign currency. In the US, the Fed does not decide what the exchange rate is going to be. The mandate for the exchange rate determination is for the US Treasury. And the US Treasury is mostly deciding to let exchange rate be determined by the markets. However, if the Treasury decides that it wants to intervene in the foreign exchange market, it makes the decision, and then the New York Fed has a trading desk, and they can buy or sell currency, so conduct the intervention on behalf of the Treasury. But they can't do it on their own. They have to get an order from the Treasury to do that. So the foreign exchange policy in the US is not decided by the Fed, and this is actually quite unusual. In most countries, the central banks decide the exchange rate policy. In the US, last intervention was vis-a-vis euro in September of 2000. Prior to that, there was intervention that was coordinated with the Bank of Japan to have Japan depreciate its currency or prevent the appreciation of the yen. As we discussed, emerging markets frequently intervene to combat inflation, and developed economies tend to intervene to weaken their currency and increase their exports, as there was a case with Japan. And here is the data for Bank of Mexico intervening in the foreign exchange markets, and you can see that they were mostly selling the US dollar. So this is data that shows purchase of the US dollar, and this is all negative, meaning that they were selling, and they keep on selling US dollar quite a bit in order to avoid Mexican peso depreciation beyond what they want to see. And Japan, on the other hand, the interventions are all purchases of the US dollars against the yen. So when they purchase the dollars, they make dollars more expensive and yen cheaper, and that helps their exports. And this concludes part 2. In part 3, we're going to talk about exchange rate predictability.